We want to welcome you here on behalf of Women's Week. This is the 6th annual Women's Week, and every Women's Week has had a theme, some dimension of women's lives that's emphasized and explored during the week. This year's theme is Women Working, and the first year's theme was Woman, a Creative Being. And tonight's speaker is Kate Millett, an author, artist, and a working woman. She has had a one-woman show in Tokyo, Japan, Greenwich Village, and she's the author of Sexual Politics, Flying, Sita, The Basement, and The Prostitution Papers. She's taught kindergarten in the New York City school system and worked as a file clerk before serving on the faculty at Barnard College and Bryn Mawr College. She's also been very active and a vocal member of women's liberation groups. She worked on the Congress of Racial Equality and was the chair of Education Committee of the National Organization of Women. She also taught courses on women's studies at Berkeley and at the Women's Writers Institute in Casanova, New York. She also directed the film 3 Lives. Since she arrived last night, she's been sharing her experiences in classes and in conversations, and always emphasizing more than one dimension of women's lives. She's emphasized that it's important to remember the progress and the experiences of women in terms of history and what came before us and how we got where we are today. And she's also made us aware of women internationally, especially through her experiences in Iran. Kate Millett and her experiences and accomplishments and the way she has worked touches all the dimensions of women's lives. Tonight she will share her insights into women working. Kate?
I'd like to talk about work and all the things it means, how it means the production of an idea or the raising of a child, the product of a work of art or the creation of very good tomatoes, and how in fact this is part of human existence, human experience, and how particularly it is part of our human experience as women. It is fashionable, and I hope to demolish a few fashionable cliches. It is fashionable to talk of discrimination against women. I'd like to address myself to that kind of terminology. The effect of calling the treatment of women discriminatory, well, of course, it's quite true, it is indeed discriminatory, but it has a kind of minimalizing effect. It produces a mentality where you kind of tinker with the system a little bit and then everything will run fine. It's like a tractor that just needs a little oil on the left side. We are not talking really about a historical situation like that at all. It is the liberal line, as it were, to say that women are discriminated against, as if this were somewhat of an oversight. I think I was raised in the United States to imagine that women simply had neglected to mention that they would like the franchise. And as soon as they raised the issue, it was immediately and gracefully accorded to them. 80 years later. And from the point of view of classic male leftist ideology, the whole treatment of women and work is, I think, askew too, because it assumes that workers are men. And this is crazy. Women are workers too. And they may, in fact, be more constant and enduring workers and they are certainly unpaid ones. And if you have a gripe, you see, as a worker, if you don't get paid at all, you really have a gripe. The other argument that is generally advanced from male leftist thinking is that, well, the situation of women is peripheral to that of the working class. It's odd that a whole class could be composed of males, but that's the assumption, and as the workers are men and so forth. Since women are peripheral beings to class feeling, class structure, class operation, and so forth, what should happen is that we should postpone everything until the workers' revolution has solved it all, and then maybe there'll be a half hour or so to sort out this woman business. So when we speak of this sort of ameliorative, minimalizing, tokenistic kind of mentality, say as phrasing things in terms of discrimination, let us please realize that it is no accident that women are treated as they are in work. It is part of a system. It is part of a system much older than the systems we recognize as our legal forms of government, whether they're capitalist or socialist or a little bit of each, or whether they're Republican or Democrat, or whether they're local or global, or whether they're democratic or fascistic or totalitarian or whatever they are sure to be patriarchal as well. By which I mean an institution that precedes all other forms of human government, or you might say human control, that is much older and far more general than any other known form of government or control, and that is the domination of females by males. And it is an entire institution of great longevity and universality, and also a good deal of subtlety, especially in our time. And it's held in line by a number of things. First of all, it has control of all other institutions, so that all legal offices, finances, the university, the definition of learning are all in male hands. Also, all weapons, very important point. All use of force. The very definition of self, ego, psychology, the very structure of thought. In fact, patriarchy rules by a number of devices that are actually applicable to each individual within it. And that is the creation of cultural patterns of approved behavior by masculine and feminine, socially approved behavior. If you want to question this, you can make the gestures of the opposite sex and see in a moment the horror on all faces. To behave in a certain way defined by these categories, which are not biologically defined, they're socially and culturally set up and also enforced. Therefore, it is feminine to be passive and to put up with and endure, as it is masculine to be aggressive and bullying and bellicose and all the rest of it. These are, of course, patterns that you can find in any ruling class and any underclass, whether it's racial or economic or ethnic or whatever. But it is maintained by a system which reaches into the very psyche and into the very definition of self. Because if you are born a male and your masculinity is challenged in this society, you are virtually annihilated. Worse still, you might even be a homosexual. Homosexuals being kept as a sort of pariah group by which everybody can compare their normalcy. Our humor at all this shows how much on the wane it is, but it is still, a force in effect. The same, of course, conversely, is true of femininity. You are judged, not that you are accorded much essence from it, but you are certainly obliged to conform to it. And even, your ability to survive depends on it. You can't keep your job if you don't wear the right uniform, if you don't behave correctly in social circumstances, particularly those involving any authority. So that we are conditioned by our temperaments now, which are trained from early childhood to behave in one pattern or another. Also, our roles are defined for us all the time, so that there is a correct way for us to act, even to gesture, even to phraseology, even to our use of the language. It is so segregated. And incorrect usages are punishable, or suspect, which is a punishment in itself. And the same, of course, is finally true of status, because all things in patriarchy that are important will be controlled by males, that is, that are regarded as important. Things that are not very important, like the raising of children, are assigned to the underclass. It gives you a notion. Now, taking the history of this institution, to speak of women being discriminated against is kind of silly. It's certainly trivializing it. It is a system in which women are systematically oppressed and have been for centuries and generations and even millennium. And the degree of that oppression is only now beginning to lift through, say, some 130 years of organized political and social agitation. And this not only in this country, but throughout the world. So the residuum of patriarchal oppression is very much trivialized when you call it merely discrimination. It's as if to say that when you speak of discrimination against blacks or the poor, you neglect racism as an entire system by which everything in a racist society operates, or class, everything in a class society operates. And as we're talking about patriarchy, let's talk about power, money, position, control. These are things exclusively in male hands, as are all institutions thereof, with only slight and trivial and really unimportant exceptions. So if you look back at this system, you can see that as women work in this system, though it is said they do not, oddly enough, not only you're not paid, you're even said that you don't do anything. Really very cruel. But taking in patriarchy the patriarchal family as the sort of model, because in a patriarchal state, it is indeed a model for the state itself. That is, the relationship of the father as the head of the family, patria potestas, the power of the father through all Roman law, all common law, the law which this country's law is based on, common law, traditionally says that man and wife are one person and that person is the man. It took a great deal of agitation and legal reform to change that. It has not really been changed yet, as long as the Equal Rights Amendment is not in force. Any one of the legal conciliations, as it were, that have been won by women in the past. You see, if you don't have it in writing, you don't have it. Try to remember that. The power of the family, then, is the social unit in which the woman exists. Because for the most part, women historically and to this day, most of us women do not have any real relationship with the larger society at all. We do not really belong to this country or nation or group or whatever. The place where we are controlled and live is the family unit. So even though we have the franchise, we don't use it very much. We also know that we cannot get elected. And women in this country are represented probably more poorly than they are any place else in the world. except perhaps Saudi Arabia. So see then the family as the unit of social control in which the female lives, her home, her family, and the power of the male within that family. All the little families headed by males are then governed by the state. And authoritarian states find this very convenient because they can govern then 5 people through governing 1, the head of the family. Because the others are all governed by him. They're only women and children, non-persons, persons with no social identity. So that the position of woman in the family is a kind of an extension of the patriarchy itself. She is now a sub-person, and her relationship to man, he for God only, she for God in him, as Milton told us, and Protestantism confirms and so forth. There is an on-the-way-up thing, of course, relating to the male god who's above the male king or president or whoever you have. And that's the sort of true direct line of patriarchal thought. And religion and law back it up. The Pope's recent visit reminded you one more time, in case you wanted to be a priest in Roman Catholicism, that you do not have this connection with himself. Another way to approach the condition of women in work, and one that is used very often, especially in discussions like this week, is to speak of women in the professions. Because you see, we have only been permitted to enter the professions for the last some 50 years. In fact, we didn't used to go to college. In fact, we didn't used to know how to read and write. In fact, enormous numbers of women in the world still are kept illiterate. So having been permitted now an education, and having been permitted a minimal entrance into the profession, which was fought for by the first feminists and the suffragists for a very long and difficult struggle, and these little changes, historically speaking, they're very great. If you say half the population of the earth went from chattel status to something verging on citizenship in 130 years, this really is breathtaking social change. It's actually transformation. It approaches revolutionary change, and yet it really, nobody died in the struggle. And so a lot of people, a lot of women, stopped dying, in fact, inside and outside. But for all this to take place in this period of time is amazing. And it was all done nonviolently, which I think you should maybe give credit for too. On the other hand, we have a situation of enormous hypocrisy at the end of it, where you are all studying, presumably, to enter the professions. Well, I wish you the best luck. All day long, I have been with women in the professions who have been telling me about the shaft. And I think it's nice that you know how really unfair your treatment in the professions will be. How systematically, calculatedly, consciously and unconsciously, you will be cheated, mistreated, how hard you will have to fight, and how necessary it will be for you to fight together and not separately. To talk of women in the professions as if some wonderful new world had opened up is another dodge, I think. It makes for a kind of illusion, so that you fail to recognize the terrible contradiction between the sort of formal liberal treatment you will have. You are paying for this education, and they have decided to sell it to you. To be employed as a scholar or a professional person after that is a whole different bargain. To be fairly treated and promoted in that is an entirely different bargain. So that you have this formal liberal permission, and at the other hand, you have a thing where you are still going to be actually treated as a sexual object. I don't mean not only that you'll be submitted to the street harassment and the general dangers of being a female at all, battering, rape, all kinds of violence, psychological and physical, on which this system is ultimately built. Because you see, it isn't just brainwashing that makes patriarchy work, it's force. As with all oppressive systems, but the great way in which it will reach you is economic. You will have your arm twisted all day long. In your university, you have no women deans, I understand. Of the 700 or so faculty members of science and arts, you have no, as I understand, department heads who are women in that faculty. You have a situation where English department, which is one of your strongest women's fields, has a large number of faculty members, something like 80 or 90, and it only has 2 women at the professorial level, but they aren't really professors, I guess. They're both associates out of 80 or 90. Now, we are not talking about discrimination. The history of women in the professions in this country is a whole lot of dead bodies crossing a stream, so that maybe somebody will finally get there sometime. Something has to be done, I think, for academic women, women in the professions, to take a very, very strong tone about the situation in which they find themselves. Not to be picked off as isolated cases one more time who don't make tenure, who don't get promoted, who don't get to be partners, who don't get to be whatever it is you get to be, if you're half that competent and wear trousers of a certain cut. And another thing about the consideration of women in the professions, and this is what I'd like to address myself more to tonight, and that is that it makes for a division between women along class lines. It makes it look that some of us, by extraordinary and heroic and preternatural effort, arrive at the doctoral degree and then we have made it. Well, A, you don't. B, C, D, E, and F, you keep falling off the mountain because they shove you. And finally, it is possible this way to lose your overall connection with the situation of women per se in patriarchal society. We are not only a class, women, since our relationship to our oppressors is a political one, but we are also a caste, so that we share many of the things that you analyze when you analyze class, traditionally, or when you analyze race, or other things where you use the word caste, where you talk about a birth group rather than an economic group. Caste is, in our case, identity. And in our case, it is also the essence of class, because our very identity depends on the way we are defined under patriarchy. And no matter what we do with this, or what little permissions we are given to change it, or to ally ourselves in some token way with the administration, or the powers that be, or the corporations, or whatever, we are still always members of this caste. In not forgetting it, I think we save ourselves. And maybe we keep from going crazy, too. Take a look, though, and this is what I'd like to direct your attention to from now on. Take a look at what women work at, what most women work at, what all of you probably will work at, too, in addition to whatever else you work at. Most women are not doctors and lawyers. Most women are waitresses, are typists, are factory assembly people, and they are housewives. And they raise children. So our need for an analysis that right away we see that because this is what most women do as work, we have to be able to cover housework. You also do housework, almost all of you. And you will do lots more. You will do most of it. But if you do, you're an awful sucker. Because I speak of work because work is how people are defined. Who they are is what they do. Not only in a world that limits many people to merely what they do, having limited what they're permitted to do to almost nothing at all but one series of tedious repeated actions, but because, humanly speaking, what you are permitted to do with your mind, your hands, your legs, your smile, your consciousness, your very sense of who you are and what your personal name is how you will actually have experienced the human condition and the thing of having been alive that number of years you are indeed alive. So this is what we are spending most of our times doing. And it is the following. If you work for a living, if you are a wage earner, you will get your wage. But most women don't do that. Or they do something in addition to that. But most of them don't even do that. What most women do with their lives is they service the wage earner. And they reproduce other people who are going to do things. And then wait on them and service them. Let me first of all sort of explain an idea that you will have to hear about later in your life, but I always thought it was terribly complicated when I first learned it. It's called surplus labor, and it's a very simple thing. That is, I'm going to pay you $1 and you can make 6 baskets for me, but I'm going to sell them for $20. So while it cost me $1 for you to make them, I just made $19. So I won't pay you as much to do what you do as I get for selling it to somebody else. Therefore, I have got what's called surplus labor. You gave me extra labor. I didn't pay you exactly what your labor cost. I paid you only a little part of it. And it is upon this entire idea that capitalist society rests. Simple, isn't it? We call it making a profit. You know, a fair profit is about 5%, but it isn't run that way. The worker must produce more in the way of commodities than his wage is worth. The unpaid surplus labor is what the capitalist is in business to accumulate and what gives him increasing power. And this is important because what happens in society where people are turned into things who work for other people is not only that they're getting cheated about the money, that's certainly true, but they also enter into a relationship with that person which is servile. And that is a kind of dependency and fear which colors their entire life, not just the hours that they do this thing where they aren't paid enough. So this is what the capitalist is in business to accumulate, this surplus labor, and what gives him increasing power over more and more and more workers. Because you see, having made the $19, I can hire more people who will also get so much less, and then I'll get more and more and more and more, and pig on down the road. He pays for some labor to get the rest of it free. You see, selling these baskets at a certain rate, I got a number of free baskets out of it because I didn't pay you what I sold them for at all. Ad infinitum until we stop him. There have been some little moves to curtail industry and free trade and all the rest of it, but they are very minimal indeed. So the basket maker then buys with wages, the money I'm going to pay you, the right to use the only thing that you have to sell, which is your time, your ability to work. The specific social relation, which is capital, then, is the wage relation. And this wage relation can exist only when the ability to work becomes a saleable commodity. Now, this is how we have seen it for men. Now hear about how this works for us. The ability to labor resides not only in a human being whose life is consumed in the process of making baskets, producing. First, it must be 9 months in the womb. It must be fed, clothed, and trained. You see, it takes a long time to make a basket maker. Someone has to change the diapers of a basket maker. And then when it works, its bed must be made. For some reason, basket makers don't make their own beds. Its floors must be swept. Its lunchbox prepared, its sexuality not gratified but quieted. Its dinner ready when it gets home, even if this is 8 in the morning from the night shift. This is how labor power is produced and reproduced when it is daily consumed in production, making baskets or whatever. To describe this thing, taking care of the basket maker, is to describe women's work. In other words, we do half of what the system has to have done, and they don't thank us and they don't pay us, and we're regarded as people who really sit around on our tails all the time in addition. The community, therefore, is not an area of freedom and leisure, auxiliary to the production of work, where by chance there happens to be women who are degraded as the personal servants of men. The community is the other half of production and capitalism. The demands of the women's movement, then, take on a new and more subversive significance. When we say, for example, that we want control over our own bodies, we are challenging the domination of capital, which has transformed our reproductive organs as much as our arms and legs into instruments of accumulation, or surplus labor transformed our relationships with men, with our children, and with the very creation of children into work that is productive to keep this whole thing going. In other words, we are doing the whole unacknowledged, unpaid, unlooked upon thing of keeping an entire society going, capitalist, socialist, or whatever it is. It has to keep making things. It's industrialist, but even if it wasn't, even if it were feudal, even if it were a simple agricultural economy, we are still the people who make its entire social relationships happen. Without us, children would starve, food wouldn't be cooked, we wouldn't do the shopping. People who have to be wage slaves or serve the Lord or whatever it is they do on feudal estates would actually have to fend for themselves. So that half of human life is taken care of by a group of people who not only don't get paid for doing it, but they also are not even acknowledged to be doing anything valuable, except on Mother's Day. And as for our working, we have always worked. What is interesting, though, is that what we used to do for work used to be acknowledged. It even used to be paid for, some of it. But we are supposed not to work. This is another trick in it all. You know the old thing, oh, your mother works? Poor you. No, you know, she lies back and eats chocolates all day. Work defines who we are, and if our work is denied, then we are denied identity. We are even denied being. And productive work, after all, the making of things like baskets and chairs and light bulbs and ideas and perfect tomatoes and all the rest, they are, after all, productive work holds society together. It constitutes civilization. Generation to generation, acquiring and carrying over, when you think of human development, over evolution, carrying over skills, utility, beauty, goods, all of that is, you know, the human achievement. Yet women provide virtually all of what is provided in the private sector, that is in the home, that little class capsule in which they largely live. They watch television the way people do in the jungles at times. So enormous is the possibility of alienation from the larger society. If you are a female in this world, you really might as well sit in a thatched roof and watch television as have any effect or connection with your own American government, people, neighborhood, or life situation. So if you see all this, all these humane values that we have spoken of as part of civilization have been historically what we were in fact excluded from. To be excluded from philosophy or aviation or the invention of physics is to be excluded from the human condition in its potential, to be kept uneducated, to be prevented from learning to read and write, or to enter university, or to advance in the sciences, or even to see yourself as potential for high science. All of that is to be excluded from the human condition in a way that is absolutely brutal. At the same time, women have provided, under these arrangements, virtually all of what is private life: the raising of children, the cooking of food, the shopping, the preparing, the arrangement of the home, the waiting upon, washing all other people's underwear. I mean, imagine, it is taken for granted that that is to be our role in life. Bizarre. And we also cherish this little myth of the private sector, our home, my wonderful home, outside the, you know, the ravenous tooth of exploitation and football and the war in Vietnam and all that rages, but in my home, you see. And we have, of course, permitted a very cruel exterior society by compensating in this corny, phony, hypocritical way with our hearth and our home and our little, really sort of Hallmark card cliches. But at any rate, the upbringing of children and all household work are not in the gross national product, but try running human society without them. But look at history again. Look at the Industrial Revolution and after. What is important about the Industrial Revolution for us as women is that it was a moment where we lost a lot and have hardly compensated through employment since for what we lost by the division of labor from out of the private sector and into a public one under the factory system. Industrialization means a shift in manufacture from the home, where it had almost always been done before, believe it or not. People made things at home. They were not so inept that they had to go out and buy, the simplest little object, because they were totally incapable of creating anything with their hands, which is where we've gotten to now. It had almost always been done before in the home, that you butchered meat, preserved food, made milk and cream and cheese and all of that. And you also made cloth, and you sewed it, and you made clothes, and you made probably shoes even, and you did most of repairs on simple machinery, since it didn't have engines in it, its parts actually worked. And this was all done by women and families in groups. What's important too is that they were not sex segregated, nor were they pitted against each other. But then it changed to outside, to the factory, to outside the home, to centralized production, to the control of another person entirely. So you are not making your own shirt now. You are making 10 million shirts. And you're doing it so fast, your head is swimming. Because you tried to hang on to the cottage industry system, and it couldn't hold up against mass production in the factory, and you went under and you went and got a job in the factory, where you had to work exactly the hours the man told you, horrible conditions, no consideration for you as a human being. Forget about your dentist, your welfare, your Medicare, your fringe benefit, your retirement, whatever. Centuries of fighting back against this system have almost humanized working conditions again for men, but not for us. Pre-industrial society, agricultural society, agriculture was originally a female province and became, under patriarchal takeover, a male province, depending on how important it was regarded. But women still did a great deal of helping in it. And manufacture, that is, the making of things, of clothes, foodstuffs, textiles, yarn, flax, preserves, and so forth, was a female province. Well, what you have to ask yourself then is, what happened when the man left the home? You see, they talk about women going out of the home to work. We didn't leave first. We got left. The man left the home, and he went out to work. Rather than stay in the home or on the land, on his own farm, and so forth. And you got lots happening. You got the evils of industrialization, the loss of control over your own life. You have to work for the factory, which is only now sort of disguising itself as corporate benevolence, but it is still a pretty hard-hearted monster. And you got slums, you got leaving the land, the abandonment of the land, which you will see probably increasingly, having been fortunate enough to withstand it till now. Sickness, low wages, hideous life in the city, great poverty, demoralization, vice, as they called it in the 19th century. That means lots of booze and prostitution, and a lot of demoralization. And other things happened too, though. Other things. Men became politicized through these transformations. They became urbanized, so sophisticated. They went from hamlets and farms to one world, as they say, and to the space age and technology. What happened to us? Well, remarkably little. We were left home, and those of us who escaped, how did we manage? Well, we got miserly wages too in the factory. We got less. We were systematically used as exploitable labor force, in and out, temporary, we still are. We were systematically underpaid. And we got to be mill hands and governesses and school teachers, and we ended up, of all things, feminists, those of us who went out. And we're hovering around our sisters still. But in staying home, women became, the ones who did, a more severe situation of their, remember they had already been governed through the family, through what the aunts or the uncles, the grandfather, the whole patriarchal tribal family ruled their fate. But since they are still staying home when the men are gone now and are in the technological age and so on and so forth, and have democratic rights and participation in unions and a sense of citizenship, and all of the reforms of the 19th century have occurred, both in labor and in political identity for males and so forth, what has happened for women? Women who were already isolated at the beginning of the industrial period are now far more isolated, provincial, poor, really poor, because now they don't have their own egg and butter money, you see. Now they have almost no way of making any money. Most of them have, as long as they stay home, they are utterly economic dependents. And so are their children, whom they shield, and are, by all agreement, ultimately the only people responsible for children are women. A curious situation when we are also the poorest group around. I guess it shows you how unimportant it is that children eat. But in staying home, women became isolated, provincial, poor, and horribly dependent. I mean dependent in every sense now, not only economically, emotionally, socially, so that the going out, as all sociological studies, particularly of working class women, show, working class women hardly ever even go out. They do not have friends, for the most part. Their friends are their relatives, because they have so little choice in friends and so little contact with the world itself. The sort of extreme of this is agoraphobia, when you're afraid to go anywhere. But a great deal about the classic housewife situation as it is perpetuated into the 20th century, if it were analyzed by a shrink, and you were describing any other group of people, they would say, my God, these are neurotic circumstances. Well, they are, of course. And so women staying home then, while women who went out were exploited, women who stayed home became more and more a colonized and subject people under patriarchy. And in fact, their oppression and condition under patriarchy was probably worse than self-respecting lady cloth makers in the Middle Ages might have been, who made a wage, like the wife of Bath and Chaucer, and who were brewsters, that is, they made beer, or ran their own butcher shop, or made sausage. Most of the sort of crafts were practiced by women. Our being unable, quote, to do anything or produce stuff is a very new invention. And inasmuch as we are permitted back into the production of things, it is at the smallest, lowest, least informed level, the most alienated from. We don't write the letter, we type it. We don't mine iron. We don't really make ice boxes, we assemble them. Ice boxes are, like very crucial to our experience in life. Icebox, woman, stove, typewriter. And there are a tiny number of women who understand, say, the chemistry of refrigeration. A few who took some chemistry, This is a very small number. Remember how, despite our education, how we are kept in one little narrow thing of humanist education, of learning about literature and a bit about the arts and so and so and so. In the middle of the 20th century, we are a backward people technologically. You couldn't find a larger group of backward people, certainly in an advanced country, even if you went across class lines. We typewrite, but we don't know how to make typewriters. I mean, really make typewriters. I mean to mine the metal that is rolled into the steel that makes the typewriter. We have no access to all those different processes. We are not only have trouble with fixing a flat, we are culturally not taught how an automobile runs, though we run them. We are so removed from technology in a time when it is really the nexus of power, which is how you make a backward people backward and how you keep them powerless. So we have the dream of infantilized, we have the dream of staying home and getting to watch TV and play with the baby and live in a gilded cage. Listen, compared with the jobs you can get, for the most part, it's probably more fun to play with the baby. It's just that to narrow human experience on the planet to that has this sort of insanity about it. So here's the paradox, again, that women's work is social. That is, it's all about people and dealing with people and being good to children and making your husband feel better and so forth. But while we deal all the time with people in this little tiny cell of where we are governed in the family, we work in total isolation. What could be more isolating than the suburbs? Each little house, and in each little house, a woman is minding a child. If the 10 of them got together, they could have 1 day off. They could have 9 days off every 10, in fact. You know, gee, all the things you could do if you had only to work 1 in every 10 days. Imagine the heights you could scale and so forth. But no, it is important that it is all alienated, all divided, that they mustn't talk to each other either. So it's very important for the television to turn you off to things like women's liberation, because those ideas are enormously dangerous, particularly for housewives. If they got into that, it would be awful. So we work in isolation, and we do not work in a socialized structure, but we work with people. It's very, very strange and paradoxical. So say that you have all these different ways of working. You have wage labor, you have slave labor, and you have unpaid household labor. Slave labor being largely abolished, hopefully. We are left with wage labor and unpaid household labor as the two forms of labor that still pertain. Men are paid. Now you see what the Industrial Revolution did is it paid men. They didn't get paid before. They sold their crop, and of course, as sellers, they were paid, but they were not paid wages. They were paid a price for what they were selling. They were merchants in that case. Not capitalists, but merchants. There's a difference. And that's an important difference to absorb, too. So if you sell your crop, or if you sell what you make, what you yourself make, and you're selling it, you didn't get somebody else to make it and then pay him hardly anything and go sell it for a lot. But what you yourself make, you are then selling as a merchant, a very ancient and honorable way to deal with what you, in fact, own and then can exchange for something, whether it's barter or currency. But after the Industrial Revolution, men were paid wages, though they were not generally paid. Most people were not paid wages before the Industrial Revolution, because most people did not hire out their work. They made something or did something. They farmed, or they made sausages or something like that. But now people are selling their time and their labor, and men are being paid for it. But women are not, because women are not being paid wages because they don't go outside the home. However, an important thing happens. For the first time, women are not being paid anything, and in a capitalist society, money becomes more and more and more important, especially as every kind of class mobility takes on effect, and it doesn't matter who your father was or what manor you were from or what your tradition is and all that. You have money. You have now a credit card. You don't even need money. Just little bits of plastic. It's all built on a fantasy, but works, you know, temporarily anyway. But for the first time, women don't have any money. That is, they had goods before, but they don't have goods now. They have, in fact, nothing. And there is only money. And men have all the money, or virtually all except the few women who work. But that is looked down on. So the vast majority of women still at this point in history then didn't work, and they also didn't have money. In fact, still at least half of women don't work outside the home, and so they don't have money. But if money is everything and you don't have it, you know what you are? You're not only broke, you're a child. You need a man to support you now. It used to be you could make those sausages or something. Now the only way in which you can survive past the marrying age of 16, 18, 21 or something is if somebody else will take you on as their dependent and you can be supported. So now you see how important it is to get married if you want to survive. Now it's crazy because he works, but you also work too. The thing is, you do the same work you always did, but now it's worthless because you don't get paid. Only money supports you, and he's the only one with money. And you have to thank him for the meal you eat. You didn't used to. You used to help grow it. So you didn't have to thank anybody. You'd also stooped over and butchered and done all those things. You have to thank him also for the meal your baby eats. And it's very shaky if he will pay any child support once he disappears, too. So even though you worked for both of these meals, you made the meal, you shopped, cooked, bought it, put it on the table, and you're going to have to clean up after it, too, while he rests, because he worked all day. You need money, but you don't grow anything anymore, and he's the only one with money, and money is the only means now of survival. Women are therefore regarded as dependent and said to contribute nothing to their support or to the economy. They are said to be parasitic, the exploiters of men. It's crazy, isn't it? Women who work the longest hours, they never have a day off. They are everywhere given no sense of self or powers of organization as workers, no power even of ego. And if your work is denigrated, if your services are demeaned to servitude, and if you have to hear men say that they sure as hell wouldn't wash no dishes and so forth, because that's woman's work, it sounds very much like listening to racist talk. So this is the situation, you know, that we have inherited. And when you talk about discrimination, gee, it's so much more complicated and deep-seated and pervasive than some little misadjustment in the system. You might even ask yourself, what is the logical solution for the majority of women who still are housewives and still live exclusively in that little family cell and so forth? It might be very logical to propose wages for their housework, since everybody else gets wages and only money gives you power and independence and a means of support and adult status and prestige in our society. It would be logical, since women in fact do work, that they should be in fact paid. It's also complicated because who would pay them? If not their husbands, who are benefiting by their direct personal services, including the washing of their underwear, then the state. And of course, then you have awful complications of the state. The state is a horrible institution in any respect. And as an anarchist, I must deplore its very existence. But how really horrible our relationship to the state could be. Also, people argue, but this would only perpetuate housework. What we really ought to do is get rid of it. Why doesn't everybody wash their own dish? I mean, after all, if everybody did, it doesn't take that long. And if you want to sleep in a made bed, you can just do it, make it. But keep this argument in mind, because I think it's one of the few ways that we can really begin to respect the unpaid work of women. And this is true also for you who will have jobs, because you'll have to do all this too. In fact, you're going to have 2 jobs and only get paid for 1. And this is as true of the Soviet Union, where they brag about having women judges, as it is of Sweden, as it is of the United States, and so on and so forth. Unless we entirely resist this exploitation of our labor, or insist it be shared, or, call to the attention of our brothers how really uplifting it is to the soul to care for young children and be close to them. Don't they believe this? And how about us who are going to work, or have worked all along? I mean, at wage labor. Because you see how silly it is, it's impossible you're not going to work, especially if you're a woman, and anything lower in the aristocratic order than a countess or something, you will certainly work. When we did work for wages, what did we work at? Our jobs were and are still extensions of housework. Laundries, canneries, textile factories, sewing clothing. Most of the women workers, the Puerto Rican women workers now in New York in the garment district, making all those clothes mile after mile after mile, International Ladies Garment Union and so forth, which they belong to, doesn't do a thing for them, really. And what we do is still an extension of housework. It's poorly paid, which is the whole point, because it is a fund and a pool of cheap labor, and what is also regarded as inferior labor, second-class citizens, citizens often despised by the union organizers themselves, men. It is also untrained labor, labor that has not been trained for highly skilled, we can say break into house painting, but not plumbing, because plumbers make more money. And they're supposed to be more skilled, although having looked over all those things, I would tell you a carpenter knows a lot more than a plumber anyway, and it's far harder to be one. But we are sweated labor, exploitable, the most exploitable labor, and we are now in a recession where women are being fired left and right, all over the place, and whatever hopes you cherish are diminishing daily. And in that crunch, the male is becoming more belligerent, more greedy, more unfair, more piggish in his insistence that the job is his. And it doesn't matter that you're the head of a household as female labor. The poorest households in America are headed by women because we are the least paid of any group. And we are also, of course, the ultimate resource for children. We are the ones who have to pay for the child to eat when the father has abandoned all schemes of child support and is permitted by this society to take virtually no responsibility for his children's welfare by really legal practice and, if not legal theory, legal practice, and even by cultural consent. And to leave the upbringing of the little, the small, and the defenseless to the least equipped, the most underpaid group of people shows you a very strange thing about a society, that it has so little disregard even for its own perpetuation. And so we are the creation of a marginal labor pool, a kind of peonage. I worked in the university, and women are a kind of peonage in the university. It's called the swinging door principle. You keep hiring female instructors. They never get promoted, they never get promoted. Out they go, next one in, next one in, next one in. If you look at any department in this college, I'll bet you that you will find a huge salary differential. And I'm speaking now to where you live, because you live, in fact, in a deeply, grossly unjust little organism right here at your university. And if you were, in fact, concerned with discrimination or unfairness, all you have to do is raise hell right here. This is your society. Change it. In doing that, you would change a great many things about your lives and those of all the people around you, and it is, by the way, pretty simple. If you kick up a fuss, you would be surprised at what a bunch of organism like this one, which can be appealed to on certain grounds and even, stamped on certain grounds of equity and so on and so forth. And it has a humanistic, and you got him so many better ways than you could get General Motors, And we also have, and this is then and now, the worst working conditions, and without recourse. So that often we do prefer to stay at home. It's not surprise, especially if you're expected to do the housework and carry all the weight anyway, you see. That way you'd have 2 jobs, and after you have in fact worked 8 hours a day, your husband still sits on his duff, and this is in the socialist countries as well as in Des Moines and so on and so forth. And all forces within a patriarchal society conspire to prevent organization among women. The male working class, not the least of it. The male working class has opposed unions for women and destroyed them from the beginning, which is ironical, because women have put a great deal of our lives into the union movement. From Mother Jones on, we have fought and struggled for better working conditions for workers who turned out not to be us, but men. Not that we minded. We thought it was great that men had decent working conditions. And much of the reform that was actually brought about in the 19th century of working conditions was posited upon, say, the Blue Book, the parliamentary reports in England, which revealed how hideous the conditions in the mines were for women and children. In reforming those conditions for women and children, because children are minors and women are sort of like children too in Victorian thinking, they had to also reform the conditions for men. Super. The same is true of some of the protective legislation that's supposed to protect women and what used to be opposed for the ERA until it seemed so natural to just extend all that protective legislation to all workers, of course to men as well. But the male union movement and working class has not done anything to help women not to be exploited in work, and we still are. Secretaries, waitresses, they don't have any unions to protect them. They have paper unions that don't do anything at all, or they mostly never have a meeting, and in most places you never even hear about the union. When I've waited on tables, I'd hear about the union after I'd been there about 6 months, and it was a joke. It wasn't a funny joke, but it was a joke. having been a clerical worker, the same thing. Again, you have no protection whatsoever. So that American working women are probably the largest group of unprotected workers that we have in this country and in many other countries as well. The male bosses, well, they're not going to help. So that you begin to understand that maleness between male union and male boss apparently is a stronger bond than worker and worker, male and female. There's another side to that, that the bond perhaps between women across class is potentially greater, too. Women are in a double bind of being told that they aren't willing to be organized, and then they're prevented from doing it if they try. We are now trying all over again to form unions for women in this country, and it's a slow and difficult process. So the dilemma that we're in of being working women is one that you can say has to be solved by some sort of economic justice, by some sort of economic democratizing process, by socialism of some sort. But it has in the past always concentrated on class so much that it has not considered women as a class. And so if you don't take patriarchy into account while you're trying to make a class change or to free people from the inequities of the class structure, you will still have to wash the underwear of your fellow worker. If you have legislation to protect you in public life, you will not have any difference in, say, the dynamic of how people act in private life. It would be very possible to pay everybody equal wages and still to have to be domestically and at home the servants of men, which is what we are the very few occasions when we get equal wages. It seems to me that the solution is to change the very basis of masculine privilege and to demolish the entire structure of patriarchy. And it's a very big job, too, because it really is so much older and more intensely built into our culture than even, say, capitalism is, which you could argue, large-scale capitalism, say, since the Renaissance. Well, that's a moment in time. That's really nothing. You have a system that you have to dismantle in every aspect of it, not only economically, but in how people act, in their behavior, in the way they talk and look at you, the way they think about you, the way they think about themselves and yourself, the way you think about yourself and their selves, in our definitions of identity, in our definitions of worth, value, importance, in the dynamic between people, the courtesy, discourtesy, the hostility, the aggression, the assumptions of superiority, the speaking down to women, which is so pervasive in our society, the harassment in public, the sexual innuendos with which we are controlled and pushed around, the sort of psychological propaganda of things like pornography, which now reigns in the absence of eroticism, alas. And all of the ways in which a patriarchal society operates on our psyche, as well as our pocketbook, as well as our daily experience in doing whatever work we do. All of this has to be drastically changed. These are enormous changes we have made already. As I said, enormous changes, still more enormous ones seem to be necessary. It also seems to be that as a humanist, not even as a feminist. An analysis where women are permitted to live full human lives, the entire spectrum of human experience from which we have been largely excluded while narrowly kept in one little place, in one little cell, where we have probably a great deal more experience of tenderness with children, being understanding towards people, all of that. But the larger part of what is done in civilization has been actually withheld, as it were, deprived. It itself is deprived, as well as we being deprived of it, as a matter of fact. And if you're going to bring about all these changes, if you're really going to change the condition of women versus work or their experience as human beings, I think we also have to realize that we must depend on ourselves, not on men. Their cooperation is very gratefully accepted, and their enthusiasm is regarded as delightful, and all that. But the analysis and the action really stem from the group who need to bring about the change, and that's us. And we would not have what we have now. We have not won, would not have won the gains that we have now if we depended on men, since we did for some 2 millennium of the Christian era, and it still never came up with equal wages or a vote. So we are dependent on ourselves. And we are dependent then on rethinking our whole relationship to what work means, what it means to be able to work, what you do when you do it, what you create or fail to create. Because a lot of work is tedious, too. That's the department we got a lot of. And to change our relationship with this is to change the whole economic basis of this culture, too. I think that socialism is the only possible way to do this, but only a socialism that is, as it were, a feminist socialism, not the male left and its usual tired, old, dried-up version of things, but where the worker is him and so forth. Socialism without a feminist analysis is so imperfect and partial and exclusive that I don't think you would bother to want to get up for that sort of revolution, no matter how long it took or how many years of decades and centuries of evolution. We are at the point where the only answer is ourselves. It is only us who will say, protect the women in this university, make possible the opportunities you want to have when you leave it, change it while you're here. We are the only way we can do it. And that means that it is your problem too, not just orators, not just rhetoricians. In fact, I'm not looking for work this week, and you will be, if not this week, next one, so that teasing you to tell you that you cannot say feminists have got me a place in college and are going to get me a job in the professions, so I can sit back and say, this has been done for me, I'm not very grateful, you're very tedious folk. No, you will have to be your own impetus, or you will never even be able to hold on to what you already have. So you will have to really go about getting it done. I wish you the best luck in the world. Thank you.
thank you. I'm not sure that if there is a correction, the correction might not prove the point more clearly than the point Kate made about department heads and deans. I know of at least one department head in the physical education department that is a woman, and I believe in the department of the science and arts. Oh, okay, so I think there's also one woman dean. No. Home economics, is that not still? Okay. Thank you very much.